If I ever get some extra time, one of my favorite things to do with that downtime is to either create or update my playlists. I don't know about you, I love messing with and creating playlists. I have Spotify, and that's where I keep them. And I have this one playlist that I call the Shelp Standard. That's right, the Shelp Standard. And that playlist to me is where I put all the songs, all the jams that make me feel a very certain way. It's like, the way I would describe it is it's like how I would feel on vacation with my best friends in California, headed to the beach and hanging out and eating fish tacos. Like that's what that playlist means to me. It reminds me of a time in my life. It reminds me of some of my closest favorite people in the world. That playlist does something to me. I'm sure you have a playlist like this. I also have one that's called The Center Holds. And it's where I put all my music, my Jesus jams, all the music that leads me to worship God. And I don't know about you. I have playlists. I'm sure you do too. But playlists make us not only feel things, they bring us to a certain place, and we created that playlist. We put that music in that spot because of what we want it to do for us and how it lifts us in a certain way, positively or negatively. I remember even when I played football, right? We had pump-up songs. We had a playlist that we kept. Now, in my day, we didn't keep it on our phone because our phones were flip phones. But we would have people who would put a CD together. I know I'm so old. And we would have a playlist of songs that were our pump-up songs before a game. You know what I'm talking about. King David, who is this crazy old Bible character, he gave us a playlist. Did you know this? In the middle of the Bible, and it's really the longest book of the Bible, it is called Psalms. And the Psalms in the middle of the Bible are literally King David's playlist. This man who wrote all these songs. By the way, all the Psalms were written with the accompaniment of music. Like you can see some of the details as you read the top of the Psalm. It tells you that it was meant to be played with this kind of music or lyric because these were songs. This was his playlist, and David's life is like recorded in this long list of playlists. A psalm that I think captures the entire spirit of what David did in this book of Psalms is Psalm number 28. And you can read with me in verse 7. He writes this: "The Lord gives me strength. He's like a shield that keeps me safe. My heart trusts in him and he helps me. My heart jumps for joy. With my song, I will praise him." David would write psalms like this all the time. David would also write psalms of asking God for forgiveness. He would beg for mercy. He would say, "God, I'm messed up. I'm broken. I'm a sinner." There are other times that he would say, "God, crush my enemies. God, destroy my enemies. I feel alone. I feel abandoned. I feel surrounded. Why can't you get rid of my problems, my enemies?" There are other times David would write psalms and they were emo, man, like straight up emo playlists. Like, "God, I feel abandoned. Have you left me to die?" And so many of these psalms express connection to God, worship of God, and many of them are psalms where he sings out loud and he declares the goodness, the beauty of God, which that is what worship is, remember? The definition of worship is when you and I express with words, music, ritual, silent adoration, the greatness, the beauty, the goodness of God. That's our definition of worship. And that is a spiritual discipline we can put into practice in our life because as David has taught us and as we have learned, it can be a source of strength. Here's how I know this. King David is not the ideal worship leader. If you and I were trying to pick the perfect worship leader, King David would have never been the guy we chose. You know why? King David was the runt of his family. He was not the tall, handsome, dark-skinned, attractive one of his family. He was the small, easily forgettable one. King David was troubled. He was emotional. He was overreactive a lot. King David was not the kind of guy who had a lot of self-control. One day in his life, you can read this in the Bible, he saw a woman bathing on her roof, because that's how things worked back then, and he saw her bathing and he wanted her. So he said, make her my wife. And then he had her husband killed in a battle, in warfare, so that he could have her as his wife. He was shady. He was lustful and he was manipulative. And David was a murderer. And yet this is a man who the Bible also calls David a man after God's own heart. Why is that possible? Because David, despite what happened to him and despite what he did, he was a man who chose to worship God. And God, even though David did bad things and so many bad things happened to David, David once had a man chasing after him, trying to kill him for months and months and months on end. I mean, David knew what trouble was, and yet he chose to worship God in the midst. That's what his playlists are. That's what his psalms are. In the midst of his bad decisions and in the midst of the bad things happening to him, he would choose to worship. Sometimes he would cry out in prayers and ask God for help, but most of the time he would worship because it became an inner strength. Let me tell you something. When you and I choose to worship, it gives us a strength that we can't quite measure with science. You know, it gives us an inner strength. It's not one that I could put on a chart or tell you what color it is in a test tube. We can't quite measure what happens to us when we choose to worship. All we're doing is deliberately choosing through words or music or ritual or silent adoration to declare, to acknowledge, to focus on the goodness of God, the beauty of God. Like, it's when you and I deliberately choose that some kind of inner strength happens to us. And I think you and I need that. We need that every day. In the same way that we pick a playlist for certain moments of our life, or we want to go and feel something. We want to go remember something, or sometimes we create a playlist because of a relationship we're in or a relationship we lost. And don't we go listen to that music to remember what it's like to be with them or to be in love like that? See, that's what you and I do with worship. That's what David taught us thousands of years ago, and you and I get to do that today. David chose to worship. It gave him a power, a strength, despite what he did. Despite what happened to him, it sustained him, and it made him a man of God. It made him a man after God's own heart. And is that exactly what we're doing? Isn't that what we're doing right now by being in these sessions? We're seeking God. And so here's what I want to ask you to do, and I want you to think about. Because music and using music to worship God as a spiritual practice can be a source of strength you didn't know you had. In fact, a lot of people think that being a Christian is just reading the Bible a lot and praying a lot, and that's wonderful. But if we don't have worship, worship is kind of the pillow, the niceness, the good vibes that we're seeking. I mean, a lot of us who attend and have been to a summer camp know that 50% of what you and I love about camp is that musical, worshipful experience that we can find nowhere else. You and I don't have to wait for an awesome worship pastor who wears denim. We don't have to wait for the better musician to lead us. We don't have to be picky and weird about music. We can choose to dwell on and to worship God. We can make the deliberate decision to worship God, to put our attention on Him and think of His goodness, His beauty, His love, all that He is. And it let us give it like strength to us, like a strength we don't have on our own. We can let it give us that strength. One of the best ways we could ever think of that would be a practice for us would be to take a psalm in the Bible and to rewrite it. For example, look at Psalm 121. Psalm 121 says this: I look up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? It comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He won't let my foot slip. He watches over me when I get tired. In fact, He watches over all of Israel. He won't go tired or go to sleep. This is one of David's favorite songs. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is a shade tree at your right hand. The sun won't harm you during the day, nor the moon at night. The Lord will keep you from every kind of harm. He'll watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your life no matter where you go, both now and forever. Here's our practice for you. Would you rewrite that psalm in your own words. Some of you need to think about getting creative now. How can you use those words? Maybe some of you are musical. Together, would you in your Trinity group rewrite Psalm 121 in your own words and use some modern words to help you with those old words? Get creative, have fun, and would you choose today to practice worship?